Nothing in this podcast or on our website should be construed as medical advice. Consult your healthcare provider for your individual nutritional and medical needs. The information presented is based on our research and is strictly that of the author and not necessarily those of any professional group or other individual.
Hi, I'm Sue Becker from Bread Beckers. Welcome to Sue's Healthy Minutes. I'm so excited you've joined me today, and I hope this episode encourages you and allows you to find the answers you have been praying for the health of you and your family. I'm so glad you've joined me today. Perhaps by now, after listening to previous episodes, you are convinced more than ever that real bread just might be the answer to some of your health issues. You want to start on this journey, but a few questions are still looming in your mind. There's so much anti-grain, anti-wheat, anti-gluten information circling out there that raises legitimate concerns. Perhaps you've been on a gluten-free or even a grain-free journey for years, so to go all in with real bread has you somewhat cautious, and I certainly understand. You might be asking, what about gluten? What about wheat sensitivities? Or how about GMO wheat or modern wheat versus ancient grains? These are all legitimate questions that truly do need to be addressed. There is so much conflicting and confusing information out there that it's difficult to know what to believe. So today, I want to address some of those concerns. I want to stress first and foremost that nothing in today's episode should be misconstrued as medical advice. I want to begin by stating that grains are one of the most nutrient-dense food groups that God has given us, and most of the world depends on grains for their nutrition and sustenance. We should be cautious when any diet advocates eliminating an entire food group, especially one as nutrient-dense as grains. That being said, let's look at wheat in particular. First and foremost, it's important to know that contrary to information you may have heard or read, there is no genetically modified wheat grown commercially in the United States. There is much information circulating about the modern wheat, or as some label it, the modern dwarf wheat, being a result of genetic modification. Well, this simply is not correct. The U.S. Department of Agriculture has never approved wheat for genetic modification. There are about 30,000 varieties of wheat that exist today, though relatively few are grown commercially, but all have been bred by traditional crossbreeding methods, either naturally or deliberate. The modern dwarf wheat that we hear so much about was actually developed over years by crossbreeding thousands of strains of wheat to produce a seed with a higher crop yield, and then finally crossing the resulting variety with a Japanese dwarf wheat. This produced a shorter plant that would not bend or break with a higher yielding, heavier heads of grain. It was actually developed to provide a hardy variety of wheat that could be grown under less favorable soil conditions, with poorer countries in mind. The shorter plant allowed its nutrients from the soil to produce more grain instead of wasting its energy on a larger plant. The modern dwarf wheat variety gained worldwide acceptance in 1980. It should be noted that trials for genetic modification of wheat in the U.S. were indeed conducted between 1998 and 2005, but the project was dropped and government approval was never requested. There is widespread resistance to genetic modification of wheat. The United States is one of the largest exporters of wheat in the world, and Japan and Mexico are two of our largest importers, and neither of them will accept genetically modified wheat. To allow the genetic modification of wheat commercially would negatively affect not only our economy, but our farmers and our presence in the world market as well. Wheat is and has been throughout history, one of the most important foods in the world, and virtually every civilization depends on it in some form or another for their source of food and nutrition. Now that we've cleared up that confusion, you may be asking, but what about gluten? Isn't gluten bad for me? And hasn't the modern wheat been modified to have more gluten in it? And isn't it gluten that is causing so many health issues? Well, let's first look at what gluten actually is. You just might be surprised. Gluten is nothing more than a term given to the stretchy substance that forms when wheat flour is hydrated. So technically, wheat doesn't contain gluten. Gluten is simply formed when the flour gets wet. Wheat and its relatives, such as spelt, emmer, einkorn, kamut, or Khorasan wheat, rye, and even barley, have a specific genetic makeup of gluten-forming proteins that are unique to wheat and its relatives. These proteins are crucial in making breads leavened with yeast or sourdough because of their gluten-forming potential. Yeast is a living organism that feeds on the carbohydrates from wheat or grains and other sweeteners found in the bread dough. A byproduct of this feeding process is carbon dioxide gas. It's the stretchy, elastic strands of gluten that are able to trap this carbon dioxide gas, allowing the bread to rise. And therefore, it's gluten that's responsible for the volume, the structure, the texture, and appearance of our finished loaf of bread. Without gluten, there could be no beautifully raised loaves of bread. These gluten-forming proteins have always been in wheat. Contrary to information circulating today, modern wheat has no more gluten-forming proteins than older varieties of wheat. In fact, studies done on wheat seeds collected for more than 100 years found that older varieties had virtually the same protein content as the modern wheat. It's important to understand that while genetics determines the type of proteins present in wheat, rainfall during the growing season has the most effect on the amount of protein in the wheat and therefore its gluten-forming potential. More rainfall will produce a lower protein, higher moisture wheat, while a drier growing season will give a higher protein, lower moisture grain. Since the beginning of time, wheat has been the yeast bread making grain of choice because of its unique protein content and gluten-forming potential. Historically, you don't successfully make yeasted breads out of such grains as corn, rice, or millet because these grains do not have the gluten-forming proteins. The proteins that are responsible for gluten formation are glutenin and gliadin. These proteins represent about 80% of the protein in wheat flour. It is the gliadin component that someone with celiac disease cannot digest. True celiac disease is a genetic condition resulting in the inability to properly digest gliadin. Without proper digestion, these proteins wreak havoc on the digestive system, causing painful bowel episodes, damage to the intestines, and even preventing nutrient absorption from food. Celiac disease is usually diagnosed by the age of 7 or 10 years old and is not reversible. True celiac disease, though, affects less than 1% of Americans. But it's quite debilitating, and a true celiac will never be able to eat wheat, whether it's freshly milled or not, or any grains that have the gluten-forming protein gliadin. The good news is that most people today that are struggling with wheat sensitivity and grains that contain these gluten-forming proteins are not true genetic celiac. And for most, their symptoms can be reversed. Surveys show that about 60% of people who have chosen a gluten-free diet have self-diagnosed that gluten is their problem or that they have a wheat sensitivity. Like stated earlier, gluten is being blamed for issues that actually might be related to other factors entirely. In episode 2, The Deception of Enrichment, we learned that the removal of the highly nutritious bran and germ during the process of commercial flour milling leaves only the endosperm, better known to you and I as white flour. White flour, for the most part, is comprised of protein and starch, including the proteins that form gluten. These proteins can be extracted from the endosperm, producing pure gluten that is often added to even 100% whole grain flour. Breads made with white flour and even those made with this whole grain flour with added gluten have a disproportionate amount of these proteins. We were never intended to eat wheat without the nutritious bran and germ components. In episode 3, Digestion and Elimination, I explained the process of digestion. I explained how carbohydrate digestion begins in the mouth as saliva containing the enzyme amylase is mixed with our food as we chew. We then swallow and the chewed food enters our stomach. In the stomach, carbohydrate digestion virtually stops and protein digestion begins. We learned that protein digestive enzymes require an acidic environment to be activated. The stomach lining has cells that produce acid to create this environment and also cells that produce mucus to protect our stomach lining from the harsh acid. However, a category of drugs known as protein pump inhibitors, or PPI for short, such as Prilosec and Nexium, are often prescribed to treat heartburn and acid reflux, two very common health complaints today. These drugs work by irreversibly blocking the action of the enzyme in the stomach lining responsible for acid production. Let me repeat that. These drugs work by irreversibly blocking the action of the enzyme in the stomach lining responsible for acid production. While these drugs may seem to be somewhat effective against heartburn and acid reflux, they are creating another problem. Remember, protein digestion requires an acid environment. But these drugs work by neutralizing the stomach acid, therefore contributing to poor protein digestion. When proteins are not properly digested, it can cause an adverse reaction later in the digestive process and even an immune response, such as an allergic type reaction. In fact, a food allergy is typically defined as an adverse immune reaction to the protein component of a food. While our good gut organisms can work to clean up some of these undigested proteins, our microbiome has often, unfortunately, been greatly compromised by the heavy use of antibiotics, creating further distress. We'll talk more on good gut organisms and the role they play in preventing food intolerances and sensitivities in a later episode. But for now, we will keep our focus simply on digestion. Does it make sense then that if these commonly prescribed drugs are inhibiting acid production in the stomach, thereby compromising the digestion of proteins, that they may also be contributing to sensitivity to such foods as those containing gluten-forming proteins? An interesting note also is the fact that the common side effects of these acid-blocking drugs are headache, nausea, vomiting, dizziness, stomach pain, constipation, diarrhea, and severe gas. And these are all identical to the common complaints that people often attribute to wheat and gluten and other food sensitivities. A well-known physician and health advocate had this to say about the American diet and drug use, and I quote, "Damage to the gastrointestinal tract from the overuse of antibiotics anti-inflammatory drugs like Advil or Aleve, and acid-blocking drugs like Prilosec or Nexium, combined with our low-fiber, high-sugar diet, leads to the development of gluten intolerance or sensitivity and resultant inflammation. I hope you listened carefully to his list of contributing factors to gluten and food intolerances. Remember what we said gluten is: nothing more than the term for the stretchy substance formed by the hydration of the specific group of proteins common in the wheat species. All of the above mentioned factors can contribute to poor protein digestion, and I think we can all agree with this powerful statement. Unfortunately, like so many health officials today, a wrong conclusion is drawn. For this same doctor, after just stating clearly the culprits of gluten intolerances and sensitivity, let me repeat, heavy use of antibiotics, anti-inflammatory drugs, acid-blocking drugs, and the low-fiber, high-sugar American diet. He goes on, though, with this statement. He declares the biggest problem is wheat. Puzzling, as he never mentions wheat as a cause. He goes on to say that our supermarkets contain walls of wheat and corn disguised as food. Wheat really gets a bad rap, as so many health advocates do not seem to be able to differentiate between the commercially processed wheat products offered to us consumers and actual wheat itself. Wheat is being blamed for the many health issues such as inflammation, digestive issues, food sensitivities, and more, when in fact it is actually the overprocessed, denatured, stripped of its goodness wheat products that are found on our supermarket shelves, and not the actual wheat itself. The truth is, wheat is a nearly perfect food, able to sustain life and health almost entirely on its own. It's high in fiber and has a very low glycemic index. And of the 44 nutrients considered necessary to sustain life and health, there are only 4 that are considered deficient in wheat. What are those missing nutrients? Vitamin A. So eat your vegetables, especially the orange and yellow ones like carrots and sweet potatoes. Vitamin C. Again, eat your fresh fruits and vegetables, especially your citrus fruits. Vitamin D. Get plenty of sunshine. Go outside. Get out of the office. Get out of the house. Get some sunshine. Most of us can make all the vitamin D we need by simply getting about 15 minutes of sunshine on our skin each day. I realize this may be difficult during winter months. We may need to supplement, or why not eat more oily fish such as salmon and tuna, egg yolks, or red meat, all great vitamin D food sources. The 4th nutrient is only slightly deficient in wheat. Lysine is an amino acid that is slightly deficient in wheat, but only for growing children. It is quite adequate for adults. But combined with legumes and beans, which supply lysine, you get all you need. So that PBJ on a slice of freshly milled homemade bread just may be the best thing for your kids after all. Well, I hope you've been encouraged with today's episode, The Truth About Wheat. The good news, unless you have true genetic celiac disease, which most people do not, your symptoms just might be reversible. While consulting your healthcare provider is always a good idea, we have heard so many testimonies from people who could not tolerate any type of commercially processed wheat products, find that they not only can tolerate bread made from freshly milled flour, but actually thrive. Real bread made from freshly milled flour is both nutritious and delicious. Real bread is satisfying. Real bread can be and should be the staff of life. I hope this is good news for you and maybe an answer to your prayers. Until next time, I'm Sue Becker from Bread Beckers, and we are here to come alongside you in this journey to help you find better health through real food and real bread. For more information, I invite you, go to our website, breadbeckers.com. We really can't wait to help you and to meet you. I want to thank you for listening today, and I hope you will join me next time with Sue's Healthy Minutes.
Sue's Healthy Minutes podcast has been a presentation by the Bread Beckers Incorporated located in Woodstock, Georgia. For more information, store hours, and learning opportunities, visit breadbeckers.com and follow us on Facebook and Instagram. Make sure to subscribe to this podcast and never miss an episode. Share this with 2 friends who would benefit from this information, and be sure to join us again next week for more of Sue's Healthy Minutes.